Zero here, and I've decided that my next long-running stream series would be the other XCOM 3, Terra Invicta. Unfortunately, it's about an order of magnitude more complicated than XCOM Apocalypse, so I've also decided to make a primer to help those that will watch the series. Note that this is just a primer, not a guide. Long-time subscribers would know that I am very particular with my guide writing standards, including important details that other guides would miss or forget to include. Even my recent list video had to be much longer than it normally would because I didn't want to half-ass things. But for this primer, I'm gonna make an exception. So yeah, not a guide. I'll run you through just enough of the basics of the game so you won't be totally lost while watching the series. I'll still explain my thought process as I play, but with this primer, I won't be repeating myself as often. Alright, what is Terra Invicta? It's a strategy game from the makers of the XCOM Long War mod. Like the said mod, it's a sci-fi alien invasion scenario, but much longer than your typical 30 to 40 hour XCOM playthrough. What I find most interesting about the game is how they somehow ended up with a game for a certain audience. We all know about boomer shooters and how boomers don't actually play them. On the other hand, I'd call Terra Invicta a Gen X strategy game. Imagine yourself being a college nerd in 1994. Your only access to anime would be through hanging out in the anime club, as a tabletop gaming club is just starting to get addicted to this little game called Magic the Gathering. PC gaming had more options. Doom just came out last year, but you were more of a strategy games type, having spent countless hours on Civilization and Master of Orion. And of course, everyone was watching the X-Files, so it also means you were also hooked on XCOM. Fast forward to 2026, and hopefully things worked out well for you and you've got more time in your hands nowadays. Terra Invicta can give you a fresh take on those experiences from 30 years ago. It's got the global domination and geopolitics of Civilization, the space expansion and spaceship building of Master of Orion, and of course the alien conspiracy and invasion from the X-Files and XCOM. Combining all those things together, you'd expect the game to be very complicated, hence the grand strategy genre it's marketed as. What complicates things even further is how the game leans more towards hard sci-fi. Because it's grounded in reality, the tech tree is massive as it tries to detail a step-by-step process on how a 21st century humanity could go toe-to-toe against an interstellar alien civilization. Then there's orbital mechanics, which even in its simplified form, ignoring the n-body problem, is still quite complicated. However, there are things in this game that push the grand strategy complexities down closer to your typical 4X strategy game. Like the XCOM games, you're given a fixed set of objectives to deal with the alien threat. This means you won't be lost as there's always at least one major objective that you can work towards. But what makes this game much less complicated than it looks is how, despite the invasion theme, it is very forgiving unless you raise the difficulty level. Going to detail would be considered spoiler territory, so I'll keep it vague. Basically, for many 4X strategy game players, their first instinct when they screw up early on is to just start a new run. It's even more tempting with Terra Invicta, as the runs can take over 100 hours to finish. But if you're a new player, I strongly suggest not to do that and continue just playing the game. You'll soon find out that while playing correctly does speed up your progress, screwing up once in a while is also not as punishing, and you have many ways to get back on your feet. In other words, you're given a lot of leeway in messing around and learning the game's mechanics at your own pace. Of course, it's different in higher difficulties, but that's why I'm going to be streaming in normal. No try-harding here, just weekly cozy game sessions. From a high-level overview of the game, let's go to a high-level overview of the gameplay. On the Earth side, the world is split into regions similar to how grand strategy games do it. Most of the game here revolves around your agents or counselors, but there's also strategic combat involving armies. On the space side, setting up space stations and outposts feel more like a typical 4X game with a first come first served type of claiming system. So being hard sci-fi, it will take a lot of research and resources just to even start mining asteroids. Space is also the only place where tactical combat occurs, three-dimensional battles involving space fleets. Overall, Terra Invicta is an XCOM-like, while not being an XCOM-like. Air quotes because it's one of my pet peeves in game mechanic naming. For me, XCOM's main innovation is the integration between the geoscape and the battlescape, and how the strategic decisions you make on a global scale affects the tactical combat, and vice versa. But nowadays, I see a lot of people using XCOM to describe any grid-based I-Go-You-Go tactics game, even if they don't have the strategic depth outside of combat. So yeah, don't expect to see grid-based tactical combat in my playthrough. Even the space combat will have to wait until I get the tech and objectives to actually do it. That's enough for the overview, let's get into the details. Starting with the premise. In Terra Invicta, the game starts with a small alien ship crashing down to Earth. The time frame that happens depends on the starting settings you choose. In Early Access, we had a 2022 scenario, the year where Early Access started. The Russian armies in Ukraine makes the year obvious. For the release, we get the new 2026 scenario, reflecting the changes in the world since 2022. Then there's a speculative 2070 scenario, which provides an accelerated start with space mining technologies available and new consolidated nations. In a typical XCOM setup, the governments of the world would decide to fund an international task force to investigate the alien-related occurrences, namely the Extraterrestrial Combat Unit, or XCOM. Terra Invicta turns this idea on its head while also taking it up a notch. Here, the world's governments go the more realistic route and don't decide to work together. Instead, factions grow out naturally from the shadows, centered around ideas on how to respond to the existence of aliens. Because of this, the factions are even more secretive than XCOM. They don't have a single base that can be infiltrated or destroyed, nor are they beholden to any nation funding them. This removes some possible lose conditions for the players. Which makes sense, as ideas are much harder to kill than even the most well-funded organization. There are 7 possible factions in the game, and at the start of the game you choose which to play and how many to play against, with the minimum being the top 2 on this list. The Resistance is a default faction, revolving around resisting the aliens if they turn out to be hostile. Basically, the closest thing to XCOM in this game. As a default, this is the only faction with a tutorial, and the suggested first faction for a new player to try out. The Servants are the default alien-aligned faction, a group that worships and wishes to submit to them. That's right, you can play as a faction on the alien side. In fact, I would suggest playing Servants after your first Resistance playthrough, so you have a better idea how the alien mechanics work for the future runs. Then there's the other factions which I won't explain here, which includes the faction that I've chosen for this playthrough, the Academy, and its cooperate ideology. This one's the hardest faction to complete, further increasing the playtime for this cozy game playthrough. As to what's the difference between cooperating with aliens and submitting to them, well, you just have to watch the streams to find out. Of course, factions can't just hide in the shadows. They still have to send out agents all over the world to do the dirty work. And that's where counselors step in. These are your main units. They have their own stats and skills, and most of the gameplay will be you giving them orders every turn. Turns, by the way, start off as 1 week, but quickly turns into 2 week intervals. Things will still happen within a week, but that's generally for later. Anyway, while counselors can be sent out to do stuff like investigate alien incidents, making them similar to Mulder and Scully, they're much more powerful than lowly FBI agents, making them more like the cigarette smoking man. We'll touch upon what counselors can do as we go along this primer. As a strategy game, Terra Invicta has a bunch of resources always displayed at the top. Let's go through them one by one. First is money. It's just money. You can use it to buy stuff or fund actions. It's also in an arbitrary value, so you don't need to worry about silly economic matters like inflation. Next is influence. How much political power you have. Say how many influential people are aligned with you, or how many powerful people owe your faction favors, etc. All distilled into a numeric value. Then there's ops, which represents how many resources you have for certain operations, whether it's military or espionage related. Then there's the space program related resources. Boost tells you the amount of stuff you can launch to space right now in decatons, and being a space game, you want to get a lot of boost early. So later on, once you get your space industry going, you don't need to launch stuff from Earth that much. Then there's mission control, which counts how many mission control centers you own. More of this means you can control more space assets, while the unused ones still contribute to your research. Research is research. We'll talk about the details later. Then there's the control point value and cap. This tells you how many nations are under your control and how many more you can get without incurring any penalties. And finally, space resources, which we won't discuss yet. Let's also quickly touch upon organizations, even though I won't really focus on them too much in my playthrough. To improve your counselors, you can wait for them to eventually level up after gaining enough experience, or you can get some organizations. These act like equipment for your counselors. You can acquire them if you got enough resources and your counselor has available administration. By attaching an organization, your counselor can get boosts to certain attributes, and your faction can also get passive buffs from them, like extra income or research. The downside is that some organizations are really expensive, either in initial costs or in upkeep, and some have requirements like being limited to counselors with certain traits, or in the case of renowned real-world organizations, limited to counselors from that region or factions that control the said region. With the high-level stuff out of the way, let's finally talk about how the game actually plays. For the initial phase of the game, you'll be slowly building up your power base on Earth to get your research and income stream started. And to do that, you'll have to start controlling nations. But here's the important distinction in Terra Invicta. Your factions don't actually get to control nations as you would in other games. Instead, your shadow faction controls the people controlling the nation. So while regional divides are present in the game and have their own mechanics, for the early game, you'll only be focusing on controlling the main pillars of a nation, each represented by a control point. Larger and more prosperous nations will have more control points, and what each point will represent will change based on a nation's government. For example, a more democratic nation may have the mass media as one of their points, while a totalitarian state may have the party or defense sector as points. What doesn't change is a final point, which represents the executive branch. Controlling it means you can set policies for the nation, like declaring war. So there's a time period of consolidation before you can even set policies. Also, you have to control at least one other control point before you can even try to control it. Another thing about control points is that larger and more prosperous nations require more of your control point cap than smaller nations. For example, controlling all of Haiti only takes 3 points, while a single point from the United States will need 35. China's even larger, with 42. So, how do you get control points for a faction? The game gives you a couple of ways to do that, but for now, I'll just run you through the most common approaches that I'll be doing in my streams. First is the standard steps for taking over an unclaimed control point, which is pretty much the whole world at the start of the game. You begin by performing public campaigns on the nation to increase your support from the population. Success is based on the performing counselor's persuasion stat and can be increased by pumping money into the campaign. You can see your idea's population share in the donut chart, and the more share you have, the more likely you'll succeed in the next step. And that step is ordering your counselor to take control of the control point. This is again based on the persuasion stat and affected by multiple factors. The amount of public support is just one of them, so you can technically skip the public campaign step if you're dealing with a smaller country. Unlike public campaign, you'll be spending political influence here if you want to pump up your success rate. The last step is to spend 10 influence to defend the control points. A single action will defend all of your control points in the nation, so you may want to wait until you get the executive branch before doing this to save on actions and influence. The problem with that is, undefended control points are pretty easy to take over, so the savings are generally not worth it. Speaking of taking over control points from other factions, there's also 3 steps to do it. First is the same. Spread propaganda to raise your faction's public support. Next is to send a counselor to crack down on the control point. This requires a high investigation stat and can be increased by spending influence. And here's why defending your control points is essential. Defended points have an extra 10 points of defense. This bonus is so high that even by the mid-game, counselors can still have trouble cracking open a defended point. The final step is to purge the control point, this time requiring the espionage stat, but still using influence. Like in controlling a point, you technically don't need to publicize or crack down before purging, but doing the latter gives you a 10-point bonus to the action. Forget about doing it on a defended point though, as the 20-point difference from a cracked point means it's practically impossible. As I said before, there are other ways to take control of a nation, like with coups or military invasions, but for most of the early game, I'll be sticking with these 2 approaches. Alright, I can't avoid it any further. Let's finally talk about this cryptic nation info window. To make things easier, we'll start with the simple stuff and work our way up. We've already mentioned the donut chart, telling you the population support for each of the ideologies. At the top are the control points. Hovering over them tells you what they represent and the control point cost in owning them. Let's ignore the military side for now, as I won't be doing any wars soon. But I do have to point out that the nuke count doesn't represent a single warhead, as US having only 28 nukes would be silly. Instead, 1 nuke represents a whole strategic nuclear barrage, enough to totally devastate the region. So don't underestimate this number. Anyway, back to the other numbers. The fist represents the amount of unrest, with 0 being peaceful and 10 meaning that the coup is probably gonna happen this week. So lower is good. The floor and ceiling symbols tell you where the value is going, and the green or red color tells you whether it's good or bad. Then there's a GDP, which is the population multiplied by GDP per capita. The GDP determines a couple of things, with the most obvious being the number of control points a nation will have. So very big GDP is 6 points, and tiny GDP is just 1 point. Note that while GDP per capita are in US dollars, they're adjusted according to purchasing power parity, so it may not match real-world values. Below the GDP per capita is the sustainability value, where higher is good. Basically the inverse of a pollution value, as the lower the value and the darker the red factory icon are, the higher the effect the nation's population has to the climate. Below that is the education level, and higher is good, unless you want maximum population growth. Then inequality, the gap between the haves and the have-nots, where lower is good. Then finally to the left, below that chart icon, are the monthly production for individual resources. The last column represents how much your faction receives. If a nation is under a federation, they will share some of their production to the federation as noted by the middle column. The federation will then redistribute it to all of the members based on their control point count. Now comes the hard part. The value with the chart is the nation's monthly investment points, kinda like Industry and other Forex strategy games. This one's based on the GDP of a nation, used by unrest and army upkeep. Nations will then assign these investment points to different priorities, all displayed in the priority tab. This whole dot or pip setup feels kinda weird at first, but it's easy to get the hang of. Basically, you get to allocate points to different priorities, and the more control points you own, the more you can influence the final percentage distribution. Like here, 12% goes to knowledge, so every month, knowledge will receive 1.092 in investment. When enough investment points go to a priority, it's completed and the nation receives its benefits or penalties, then goes back to 0, then reinvesting the extra back to it. To see how this works, let's go through some of the simpler priorities. If you want to earn money, you have two options. You can tell a nation to invest in funding, where it then invests in private enterprise, which then regularly funnels cash to the factions controlling it. Try not to think too much about whether this is unrealistic or too realistic. Just know that every time you invest one whole point into it, you'll get extra monthly income. Alternatively, you can get a quick buck by going for spoils. Controlling factions earn a lump sum every time this is completed, and some corrupt elites get a cut, so there's a lower chance of coups and revolutions. Downside is, spoils damages the nation, economically, ecologically, and so on, so you'd want to use this as little as possible. So, as I mentioned in the prologue, taking control of an oil-rich nation, then getting a couple of spoils in is a valid strategy for the early game where you're severely lacking in cash. Another simple set of priorities, the space stuff. Mission Control adds a space control facility once it's completed. Boost, on the other hand, creates launch facilities, adding to controlling factions boosts income. And since the game is trying to be harder sci-fi, nations with regions near the equator will get more boost income per completion as it's easier to send stuff to space there. Note that nations without a space program will have to spend 50 points first before they can do either, unless they're in Federation where the lead nation has it. Now onto the hard part. Some of the values we skipped earlier have a complicated relationship with priorities, mainly because they themselves aren't that simple. Take for example the government value. It tells you how democratic a nation is. You might think, this one's easy. More democracy is better, right? Not really. It's great for research, but the free press also means other faction ideologies are always welcome to the population. And negative events like committing a war crime will upset more people. Having a totalitarian government through a low government score is the opposite. Research is stifled, but censorship makes it harder for other factions to break in. And stuff that won't fly in democracies like internal propaganda and oppression tactics actually work in quelling internal strife. In short, unstable nations may want to stay with authoritarian governments while they fix their problems. Middle value is anocracy, pretty much the worst option as you'll get the penalties of both extremes. But it's a necessary stepping stone if you want the nation to move towards democracy. Or totalitarianism if that's your jam. The other value where higher isn't always better is cohesion, which tells you how united the population is. Low cohesion is obviously bad, with zero cohesion greatly increasing unrest. But at the same time, high cohesion represents a cult-like monolithic belief among the nation's population. Sure, there's no unrest, but research takes a hit as if you have low cohesion. So ideally, you'd want middle cohesion to get maximum research bonus from the diversity of ideas. Even though I just explained why higher isn't always better, I don't think that's enough to prepare you for the tangled web that is the rest of the priorities. Take the first priority, economy. It boosts GDP per capita, but increases inequality, so you'd have to balance it out with a welfare priority. In addition, economy priority is affected by government and education, so you might want to think about investing on those first so you'd get better returns in the long run. But it's a chicken and egg scenario, as economy affects GDP, which gives you investment points in the first place, so not allocating anything to economy is generally a bad idea. Not to mention stuff like climate change will lower your GDP eventually, so you'd also want to offset that beforehand. What I'm trying to say here is that you might be better off watching my streams and wait for the parts where I juggle priorities and walk you through my thought process. Wrapping up this primer, let's finally talk about research. As I mentioned earlier, Terra Invicta has a huge tech tree owing to its hard sci-fi nature. Another reason why it's so big is it's split into two types: global research and faction projects. Global research are technologies that can be worked on by all factions. As we can see here in the research screen, the top 3 techs are the global ones, and you can decide how much, or if you will, contribute to each of the research. Once completed, all factions will receive the tech, with the faction that contributed the most getting to choose the next global research to replace it. The bottom row are your faction's research projects. These are unlocked through global research or completing in-game objectives. And once completed, only your faction will receive the tech. Like with nation investment points, you decide how much of your research to pump into these projects. So ideally, you should put at least 1 pip to each item to get a distribution bonus. You might notice that 2 of the faction project slots are unavailable at the start. These are unlocked through different means. The first one I already unlocked in the prologue by getting an organization with a projects bonus. The last one I'll probably unlock around episode 3 to 5. One last thing to mention about research: some faction projects are not guaranteed to be unlocked after researching the corresponding prerequisites. This is denoted by the percent value lower than 100%. While annoying sometimes, it forces you to think about backup plans rather than beeline to a certain tech route as you would in other games. This also encourages trading with, or stealing from, other factions. However, if you don't like it, you can always disable it when you start your campaign. Alright, that's it for this primer. I'll probably make another one once we get to the space stuff or terrestrial combat. But for now, that's most of what you need to know to not be totally lost while watching me play. As for the other details about the stream, my default schedule would be 12 noon UTC. It's also going to be a bit different from my XCOM Apocalypse playthrough, as I will be more laid back, with an overall cozy game vibe going on. That means I also won't be save scumming like I did previously, so you'll have a chance to see the comeback mechanics. To close things out, I'll have to explain the PowerPoint thing. While it's true that I'm doing it because I need to rush this out before episode 1, it's also a Perun reference. In case you're not familiar with Perun, he was a smaller YouTuber playing niche strategy games like Dominions 5, until he did a PowerPoint presentation on the Ukraine invasion, which in hindsight is still more insightful than what other commentators were saying back then. So now he does weekly slideshow presentations on defense topics. Coincidentally, he also backed Terra Invicta's Kickstarter before he got big, so he's present in the game as an org. Anyway, don't expect me to do more PowerPoint presentations in the future, unless I do it live or I need to rush out lower effort videos like this one. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching and see you in the playthrough streams.